Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CG podcast, where we explore the legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic on science, society, and public health policy. I'm delighted today to have our guest, Johan Anderberg, who's a Swedish journalist and writer of the book, The Herd, How Sweden Chose Its Own Path Through the Worst Pandemic in 100 Years, which was translated into English in 2022. It describes the no-lockdown approach taken by Anders Tegnell, the Swedish state epidemiologist, and the influence of his long-term mentor and previous state epidemiologist, Johan Giesecke. So wonderful to have you on the podcast, Johan.
Thanks for having me.
So, okay, Sweden, right? The Swedish experiment. You actually talk a little bit about that term in the book. You titled it The Herd. Give us a sense of the argument and sort of the experience of Sweden in 2020 and what motivated you also to write this book.
Sure. Well, as a writer in Sweden, I thought it was probably the best story that a writer could hope for. That, like living in Sweden and knowing all the things that's going on, and Sweden doing like the complete opposite of the rest of Europe, pretty much. And to be honest, I was pretty sure that it was a sensible approach from the beginning, and that time would show that as well. So. I kind of had a feeling how it all would end, because otherwise it might have been a little bit difficult if it had been something that would have been a little bit less clear, so to speak. So, but the book is pretty much a narrative nonfiction story about how and why Sweden chose this path that pretty much everyone knows about now.
Yeah, hence the word experiment. But you actually flip that on its head in the book, and you say, well, actually, the world is the lockdown countries. They're the ones who did the experiment, and Sweden pursued a sensible, according to the pandemic plans that had been put into place previous to 2020.
Yeah, definitely. When you think about it in hindsight, it's pretty obvious that it was the rest of the world that tried something totally new, something that had never been tried before at all, and. I don't think anyone could have imagined the scale of the social experiment that was undertaken in so many countries beforehand.
Yeah. So, and in the book, you describe the pressure that Tegnell and others, a part of his team, felt during that time, especially when Britain decided to flip from Plan A to Plan B and pursue a lockdown, because at that point it was basically the UK and Sweden who were kind of holding out, right? And so he was, and then he also the way that the international media treated Sweden during that time. So can you just give us a sense of how much pressure these personalities faced?
Sure. A lot of people have forgotten about this, but actually it was the UK that had that were kind of famous for having the laissez-faire approach for a few days or maybe a few weeks in the beginning of the pandemic. So at first, the spotlight wasn't on Sweden at all, actually. But then, as the days went by in March, more and more countries around Sweden started locking down, and also the neighboring countries here in Scandinavia started locking down, just like France or Germany did. But England or the UK still had a very open approach. So during the first couple of days, Anders Tegnell and his associates actually emailed YouTube videos of Boris Johnson explaining the strategy, of Chris Valens explaining the strategy, and so on. So the Swedes in charge were quite shocked and surprised when the UK flipped.
Right.
And then the spotlight turned to Sweden, and there were so many journalists traveling to Sweden to ask Anders Tegnell, and Tegnell was really forthcoming. He was really open to the media. He spent a few hours every day talking to foreign news reporters. So it was quite interesting to watch.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one thing in the book that I was surprised about, actually, and you draw this parallel between Anders Tegnell's policies during the H1N1 pandemic in 2009 and his sort of approach during COVID. And one thing Tegnell did was that he recommended the mass vaccination of children, for H5N1, which led to a large number of children suffering from narcolepsy, which became a national scandal, right, in Sweden. Can you just give us a sense of that history and whether it really played a big role in his thinking?
Yes. So what happened during the swine flu was that Sweden had entered into these contracts with a few pharmaceutical companies and those countries stipulated that if the WHO upgraded the pandemic to a certain level, the Swedish government would be forced to buy these vaccines. So they were forced to buy these vaccines, and of course they weren't forced to actually hand them out, but they made a back of the envelope calculation showing that it would be beneficial. And in hindsight, it was probably the wrong decision, but they, of course, they couldn't know that by then. And then what happened afterwards was that there was quite a lot of media investigations, and a lot of people in charge realized that they had probably made the wrong decision about this. And what happened then was that, this is kind of my theory, that the Swedes here in charge were kind of hesitant about using epidemiological modeling, and that you need a certain sense of common sense to understand a pandemic. And that also made these people kind of famous in Sweden. So maybe they got like a first impression of the media frenzy that would come 10 years later.
Yeah, and in the book you describe essentially the team throwing out the predictive models that they had been tasked with creating, just saying, hey, look, we can't actually predict the future based on these models. And and with that experience, they understood the approach taken by the Imperial Group that was the basis for the lockdown policies, and they were very skeptical about the sort of the accuracy of those models as well. And there's back and forth that you describe in email correspondences as the teams are struggling with understanding what the best course of action is. Just give us a sense, so for people who are not completely familiar, because there's an idea that Sweden just did nothing, right? What policies did the Swedish government put into place?
Well, for the first couple of months, they did practically nothing. So, but then as the pandemic continued, and also when the pressure from the politicians and from the media and from foreign media kept building, they had a few restrictions. The thing is that most of them were kind of perfunctory, I would say. For instance, closing bars at 10:30.
Right.
No one would be infected before 10:30. But the sad part of it was that they closed the high schools a few months before graduation day. And then they opened them up after the summer again. But then as the pressure started building again in the fall, they actually closed them down. And they were pretty closed for probably in a total of 4 or 5 months.
Okay.
So that generation is pretty hard hit in Sweden as well, even though all schools up to the age of 15 were open. So I mean, the damage was much less here than in the rest of the world, but still, it was pretty obvious that they kind of didn't believe in this measure either. So your children had to pay a pretty high price for that political showmanship.
Okay, that's very interesting. Now, the narrative in the book ends in early 2021, and you're describing this tension between Tegnell and his group of epidemiologists and the central government in their approach. And you actually say this is a point where Sweden actually abandons the Swedish approach. Can you just describe what was going on then?
Yeah, they are kind of abandoned in terms of breaking with a strong tradition in Swedish public health. and it's by this time, a year into the pandemic, the vaccines have become widely available, and people in general are pretty positive and pretty open to taking them. But for some reason, the Swedish government wants vaccine passports for events with more than 100 people. And this makes so many people furious. And it's pretty much for no reason that Sweden does this, because it has like no effect whatsoever. And it creates really big tension in society. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that Sweden really abandons this common sense approach and really starts doing these like political posturings that have and having these measures that have no effect at all on mortality or anything like that.
It seems to me one important element to the Swedish experience is this unique relationship between scientific advice and the political machine. Can you give us a sense of how that works in Sweden?
Yeah, so in Sweden, the government office, like the head government office, like the equivalent of Whitehall in the UK, is pretty small, and all the competency and all the experts are decentralized to the authorities. So it's very difficult for the prime minister to override something that the authorities have decided. And in many cases, it's even illegal. It's like one of the most common ways for a government minister to resign in Sweden is to have meddled in something that a government authority is supposed to be taking care of.
So now that the pandemic is behind us, looking back, how can we evaluate whether the Swedish experience was better or worse than what was pursued in continental Europe, the UK, the US? How do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's pretty simple, because when you look at the mortality stats in Sweden during the first year, they're pretty low, among the lowest in Europe, even though Swedes had a much higher degree of freedom throughout the first year. And Sweden abandoned all restrictions pretty early as well. And looking at the whole pandemic as a whole, Sweden has the lowest mortality rate according to quite a few studies. And this is not just something like the Swedish Bureau of Statistics have come up with. This the WHO, the Johns Hopkins University, and the British Statistics Agency. They all say the same thing, that Sweden had a very low mortality throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you do see a spike right at the very beginning, but then compared to other countries in 2021 and 2022, you don't have the same excess mortality, right? And
the funny thing is that this is exactly what the Swedes in charge said would happen.
Yeah,
that the rest of the world would catch up.
Yes, right. And so Sweden is this interesting experiment that keeps giving, because it proves the lockdown approach to be incorrect, right? And then also there's this huge social debate, especially in the UK, about excess mortality and the possible role of vaccination. But Sweden is one of the most highly vaccinated countries in the world that received the COVID vaccine, and yet you don't see that excess mortality increase like you do, let's say, in the UK and elsewhere. Yeah,
it's kind of funny, because the Swedish approach doesn't make like anyone happy.
Right.
Because anti-lockdowners are in general a little bit skeptical towards the vaccine. So it only satisfies a very small technocratic academic elite that is anti-lockdown and are kind of in favor of vaccinations.
Or those who prefer the old pandemic influenza plans and understand the sort of nature of herd immunity and how that works with respiratory viruses, and prefer governments that don't use authoritarian means, etc. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a broader church than that, but
definitely. And speaking of the vaccination, I think vaccination is like two separate issues. There's one like very technical medicinal debate as to whether the vaccines worked or not, and then there is the debate on whether to force people to and when it comes to forcing people to take the vaccine. I think it's a horrible strategy, and it goes against like Western tradition, and it's probably a really bad way of making people take the vaccine. In any case.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing that effect, that loss of trust throughout the world, especially in the United States, and also continental Europe. And it's going to be something that's a generational problem now, right? The distrust that's been created through the Green Pass or vaccine employment mandates in the United States. Can you give us a sense about how the Swedish public thinks about the pandemic? Do they think that they won and the world went crazy, or are there segments of the Swedish population that think that Sweden got it wrong and they should have locked down? And what's the national sentiment?
I think there's like a kind of palpable contentness, a little bit of smugness even.
All right, smugness, yeah.
But I think it's all right because, as you probably know, Sweden has been in the news for other reasons related to like rise in crime and migration and all that stuff. So it's pretty nice that we got something right.
Okay, right. It's a sense of national honor or whatnot, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
but there were people that were very skeptical towards the strategy. But I mean, they have gotten pretty silent, I would say.
Okay. Yeah. And so Anders Tegnell has sort of stepped down. He actually has a book that he's coming out with, I think, in the next few months or so, right? A sort of memoir, recounting of his story, his life story. If there was looking to the future, if there's another respiratory pandemic in the next few years, do you think that Sweden is going to pursue the Swedish approach, or do you think that the kind of pulse in the Office of Epidemiology and would take a different approach there?
I think legally speaking, it would be the same approach, maybe even more relaxed. But what people really don't realize about this Swedish approach, so to speak, is that it's kind of based on people making their own decisions. So, for instance, if there would be a virus that had like a 10% mortality, you kind of don't need any laws anyway, because people would just stay at home. And I think that's like one of the lessons from this pandemic, because you can see that throughout the world that people are pretty good at adjusting their behavior to the risk.
Yeah.
Like, you can see that in some U.S. states that are pretty free, so to speak. Even in Florida, the first couple of weeks, people were kind of like, let's wait and see what this is. And when they figured out it wasn't that dangerous, then they started moving around.
Right. Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, I guess the problem is that in a lot of studies and among the public health community at large, that role of voluntary behavior change and individual agency has been downplayed, and that story hasn't been told in quite the way that it needs to be, right?
Yeah, definitely. And in Sweden, lots of older people, they definitely took quite a few precautions. They definitely took it way more easy than they would have otherwise. So it's not as if like all the old people were out clubbing all night either.
Right. Yes. Although maybe that would be quite healthy, right? I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, but for instance, like all the ski slopes in Sweden were open, and they were closed in Norway. And that's like a perfect example of how to behave during a pandemic. This is outdoors, it's healthy.
And also Sweden had a government evaluation of its approach that was done quite early on. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was completed in 2022 over just a few months. Is that right?
Yeah, even 2021, I think. Okay. Yeah, it was way too early, and they were a little bit critical, but not that much. It was pretty good that they had already figured out that keeping the schools open was the correct approach, but it mostly criticized some technical stuff about how some hospitals couldn't get the right equipment on time and so on.
Yeah.
But when you ask the people from the commission now, they have definitely toned down the whole criticism. And I think if they would have done it now, I think it would have been like a totally different headline coming out of it.
Oh, really? What would have been the shift?
Yeah, because the first report came out like even before the first year had passed.
Oh, really? In 2020?
Yeah. So the mortality stats then were useless.
Right. I think I remember they made a big deal about the early spike in deaths in nursing homes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and then the nursing homes is one thing that has been quite badly run in Sweden for like 20 years, as it has in probably lots of countries.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so you think if they so essentially it sounds like you're saying they should have waited a little bit longer to do this type of evaluation, which would make sense. Like doing it sort of in the year that the crisis is still, occurred seems a little bit premature.
Yeah, and especially since the Public Health Authority said from the outset that this is like a 3 or 4 year strategy.
Right.
Then you need to give them at least, like, you can't give them just 1 year.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I mean, that is why the Swedish experience is so important and why your book is important, because evaluating the policy decisions made in 2020 and 2021, you've got to take a longer horizon, and exactly that with excess mortality, right? I mean, you have to evaluate it over 3, 4, 5 years rather than just pointing to the first couple of months of 2020. And yet it seems like a lot of people made up their mind about Sweden, that Sweden had failed, right? I mean, there were lots of media articles written in 2020 and even 2021 about the Swedish experiment failing, etc. I don't see a lot of those articles, at least in many outlets, sort of revisiting that question. Do you?
No, very few actually, and it feels like there are like other people writing those stories now. There was a book by Bethany McLean in the US and one more journalist who wrote about the lockdown policy as pretty flawed. But I think it would be really good for these publications like the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and so on to really publish like a mea culpa, because I think they have a problem in general of being very like more partisan than they used to, and I think that would go a long way towards like finding a new way of approaching like what we don't know and what we know.
Yeah, I mean, and also just address the puzzle, or just how paradoxical it is that the left-leaning outlets, which traditionally would support Sweden as social democracy, somehow equated them with Republican red states like Texas and Florida. So interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it got like the whole pandemic got caught in the culture war, and I think that's why the schools were closed for too long in so many countries. That people equated lockdown, like a laissez-faire strategy with Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and so on.
Right.
Ron DeSantis, for that matter.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's lots to say about that, Johan. So thanks so much for joining us. And that was Johan Anderberg, Swedish journalist and writer of the book, Unherd, How Sweden Chose Its Own Path Through the Worst Pandemic in 100 Years. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.